I thought I'd briefly say who I am and what I've done before starting to pontificate about restaurants, particularly as you know a lot more about them than I do. I've been in the restaurant business for the last 32 years. I owned a restaurant during the 1980s, L'Escargot in Soho, which one gentleman at the back knows extremely well because he was one of my best sommeliers, Dominic Ford. I then sold my restaurant, and since 1989 have been writing for the restaurant column for the Financial Times. And two significant things since then. The first is that just over 2 years ago, I published this book, my first and only book, so The Best and the Worst, obviously, of Nicholas Lander. And it's called The Art of the Restaurateur, and it's profiles of 20 top restaurateurs from around the world and the lessons that I learnt interviewing them. And there were supposed to be copies on sale here, but there aren't. There are only 4 copies, which came in a courier. And we thought they're for sale with all the money going to a local charity. They're £25 each. So if anybody's interested, the books are here and all the proceeds will go to a charity which Jennifer will organize. So thank you in advance for that. The other thing that's happened to me over the last 2 years is that our son became a restaurateur. He's now opened his second restaurant, Portland, having opened the Quality Chop House a couple of years ago. And I can honestly tell you that nothing makes you feel as old as saying that your son or your daughter is doing the same as you used to do. It's as though a whole lifetime has evaporated before your very eyes. But I'm very, very pleased and delighted that the last 30 years have been in the restaurant business, because I think for a couple of reasons, it is the most exciting and will continue to be the most exciting and gratifying profession anybody can fall into, which is what happened to me. I think during those 30 years, there have been 2 significant changes. The first is unquestionably for the better, which is that when I came into the restaurant profession, there was a huge conflict between a lot of the vested interests in the business. The customer always thought that the restaurateur was trying to pull one over them. The restaurateur thought that the customer was trying to pull one over them. The wine merchant was always trying to cheat, maybe slightly too strong a word, but never get the best, to give the best to the restaurateur, and so on and so on. I think all that has changed for the better. And now there is a much more collegiate approach to looking after the customer. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. I also think that one of the things that's changed in this period is that now food fulfills a very different role for many of the people walking in through a restaurant's door than it ever used to. I was at a dinner not long ago, and there was a man at the end of the table who was a designer. And he came up to me at the end of the meal and said, "You're a very lucky man," which is often said to me. "You've got a great job." He said, "But food for me fulfills a really particular place in my life now." And he said, "It is my only legal high." You know, when I was kind of developing my business, when I was younger, I could do drugs, perhaps. I could drink too much. I could look at more women than I do now that I'm married. All of those are now forbidden fruits. And the only legal high is food. And I think that was a really interesting aspect, a view of the restaurant business. The thing that I think has changed most over the last few years, that I don't think the restaurant industry has coped with at all well, however, is the impact of the financial crash of 2008. Because I think that marked a watershed in how people look at restaurants. I think before then, in the previous 15, 20 years, from the 1990 onwards, chefs were everything and were determined to give you the most exciting and perhaps challenging food that there was available. I don't think customers any longer want to be challenged. They want to be excited, they want to be titillated, and I think in the press this gets transformed much too readily and too easily into what they want to be given as comfort food. I don't think that's right either. But I do think that customers, when they come in, they want their time edited to best effect. They lead, a lot of our customers lead rather boring, tedious lives, and a break in a restaurant for however long a period of time it is a great oasis in their working or social lives. And I think that what we have to do is make the best of that. And I'm not sure many people in the restaurant industry have really grasped that. There was a very interesting comment made 20 years ago by a man called Michael Jules Sapiro, who started a coffee chain called Aroma and would have made a lot more money had he started the business 5 years later, but he just got his timing wrong. But he always used to say that what he wanted to do at Aroma was give 15 minutes, his customers, 15 minutes in the sunshine. And I think that was a fantastic, brief expression of just what restaurateurs have to do now. I think we're in a particularly good position to do that because, in my opinion, there are only now 2 industries that are totally immune from the ravages of the internet in terms of retail. The first is hospitality, and the second is health and beauty. And the obvious connection between them is that you have to take your body along to both of them. You can't download experiences from either sitting at home. And this is one of the big changes, I think, because the landlords, big landlords and retailers landlords and property developers who used to rely on the retail industry to fill a lot of their premises are no longer able to find customers for these spaces. And one of the biggest projects I've been involved in as a consultant to King's Cross, the big development there, has been how immediate the response from the hospitality providers has been, people like Caravan, the Greek Larder, in re-establishing this wonderful part of London, but how slow the retailers are to pick up and see the potential of the site. Finally, I think there's one elephant in the room, as it were, which people in the restaurant industry never fail to address properly, and that is, of course, the question of training. And it's very interesting, in today's FT, they've just had the latest figures from the restaurant industry in America, and over the last, I've got the figures here, excuse me, the last 6 months, sales are up 11.3%, and it's the fastest annualized rate of growth since 2006, which of course is making everybody smile with a great deal of pleasure. But of course, the downside of that is they're saying we can't find the staff. And I think it's been a constant in the restaurant industry ever since I was involved in it, and I think I was guilty of it as much as anybody else today, that we don't train our staff well enough, and eventually it is going to really come back and haunt us. There was an article in The Guardian last week that was saying that there's now such a shortage of trainees in the building profession that they think bricklayers are going to be on £1,000 a week in the near future. Now, what that's going to mean for people in the restaurant industry, I don't know, but it can't be good news. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about what it takes to be a restaurateur, a successful restaurateur. Many of these points you will know, but these are, I was sitting at my desk 3.5 years ago, when I got an email from the managing director of Phaidon saying, "We like your writing in the FT. Do you think there's a book inside you?" And I replied immediately saying, "This is the book I want to write, The Art of the Restaurateur. It's profiles of 20 top restaurateurs around the world, and these are the characters I'd like to talk about and interview." And the reason I did it is because, perhaps selfishly, having been a restaurateur, I think that chefs have had far too much publicity over the last 30 years, and restaurateurs have not had enough. And also that actually, if customers want to be looked after and cared for, chefs can't do that when they're behind a swing door watching the pass. So I spent a very enjoyable year, as you can imagine, interviewing the 20 characters in my book. And these are some of the lessons I subsequently gleaned that are essential characteristics in what it takes to be a very successful restaurateur. So I'll run through these. We're going to have some questions after I've interviewed Jean-Luc Naret, but if there's any time, there are a couple of mics going around the room. If anybody wants to ask a question, just raise their hand at the end. Thank you very much. So, what does it take to be a successful restaurateur? Well, I just thought I'd start by asking people, how many of you know why there isn't an N in restaurateur? Great. Well, the answer is because, and it lies in the noble history of our profession, because restaurants started in the mid-18th century in Paris before the Revolution. And a restaurant, le restaurant, with an N in it, was a soup, a clear soup that became very fashionable because then people thought, the wealthy, thought that if they ate well, they would be spiritually better off. And so a restaurant originally was this soup that was served by restaurateurs without the N, who restored their customers to good health. And I think that this is a really interesting, one of the things that most annoys me about when I'm interviewed is that people say to me, well, good British food only started with Jamie Oliver. And I know that's not the case. And I think there are a lot of people who believe that restaurants started with television programs 25, 30 years ago. And that's not the case either. We're part of a very, very long and noble profession that goes back to the middle of the 18th century. And I think something we ought to be very, very proud of. And particularly this aspect of restoring people to good health, which I think our customers need more and more of. So, from history to the present day. This is me outside my former restaurant in Greek Street, Soho, with something, an aspect of the restaurant business that I think is utterly and utterly essential. And in fact, when this slide first went up, when Jean-Luc Naret was standing here half an hour ago, he laughed when he saw it. And I just wonder if there's anybody in the audience who would like to disagree with this point. Or perhaps I could say, I wonder also how many people would say, looking at me as a restaurateur, that there are on 2 occasions, I've been in restaurants on 2 occasions, when people have sadly died on the premises. And I think, again, that's not saying anything other than these are aspects of the business that happen and need to be understood as part of the life of a restaurateur. It is extremely annoying when people cancel at the last minute, especially when you've put a great deal of effort into their booking. But this sense of humour, this idea that tomorrow somehow you'll make up for it, is absolutely critical. This gentleman on the right there is Danny Meyer, who has founded some of the New York's best restaurants, Union Square Cafe, Gramercy Tavern, The Modern. He was in the news a couple of weeks ago because Shake Shack, shares for Shake Shack hit record heights. And this is one sentence that he passed on to me about what's driven him over his last 30 years in the restaurant business. A love of food, wine, and one's fellow man. And it's interesting how it's often the first two aspects of that sentence that everybody associates with, but actually it's the third that is possibly the most important. It's often said it's just location, location, location. I think to a certain extent that's still true. The gentleman on the right here is Mark Sainsbury, who was heir to the Sainsbury supermarket fortune, but decided that restaurants would be a much better way of either keeping his sense of humour or not getting so closely involved in corporate politics. And he found a premises in Exmouth Market when it was so down at heel and dangerous that they had to put shutters down on it every night. But it's been a huge success, and it has transformed an area that is now one of the most sought after areas in London. And he did it partly because that was all he could afford, despite his personal wealth, and partly because he just had a sense that what was a former supermarket would make a great restaurant. That's Morrow in Exmouth Market. This is Nigel Platt Martin, who is the only restaurateur in my book who has never had to close a restaurant. It is interesting, however many successful restaurant people have, most of them at some stage or other have to close at least one, and invariably they say that it's the one that they have to close that teaches them more about running a restaurant than all the successful ones. He started as a lawyer and then a merchant banker, and was driving through Burgundy when he had a glass of Savigny-les-Beaune, and it was a Damascene moment, and he decided to give up his former career and go back and open restaurants. And he was the original partner with Marco Pierre White in Battersea, and then with Bruce Poole in what became Chez Bruce. He's then opened the Square, La Trompette, and various other restaurants in central London. And his theory is that, well, there are two aspects really to his success. The first is that he treats every restaurant opening not as a restaurant, but as a business case. And the second is that when pressed, when I asked him who was the most important person in the success of his restaurants, his answer was not one of his chefs, but the Indian builder whom he met before they opened their first restaurant. And he and this builder have formed a working relationship that he says has underpinned all the success of his restaurants. Because, as you will know, restaurants, when they're successful, take a lot of wear and tear physically, and being able to keep them in the best condition is absolutely essential. This is the first of three wonderful women. Married Pierre Tryre, who went to cookery school as an 18-year-old in Grenoble, sat opposite Michele Garneau. They fell in love, and she went back and married into a 3-star Michelin restaurant, where all the people in the family had to live above the restaurant, and she described it as hell. That was her one-word description of what living with the in-laws was like. Over the years, she's transformed the business, which now still has its 3-star restaurant, a bistro next door, and a place in the countryside. And she has done it following these principles: inspiring and leading from the front and communicating. And apparently, although it's not physically the case, she has more than one pair of eyes. And she is able to walk into a restaurant and see what is going wrong before any of her managers, any of her staff, and put it right. And those are fantastic qualities that you need to run a top restaurant. These are a couple of brothers, Sam and Eddie Hart. Sam on the left, Eddie on the right, who started Fino, then have had great success with Bar Fina and also with Quo Vadis in Soho. I put this up. I don't think there'll be anybody in this audience who will disagree with that, but I put this in because ever since television came along and studied the restaurant business, I think there is a lot of people are under the delusion that the two most important pieces of paper in the restaurant business are actually the menu and the wine list. And this is, of course, not the case. It's the lease and the alcohol license. And I stress this all the time to people who are not in the industry. This is another extraordinary French woman, Maggie Lacose, who started life washing dishes in her parents' restaurant in Brittany, moved with her brother, the chef, to Paris during the 1980s, and then decided, when she saw all the wealthy American customers coming into her restaurant in Paris in the 1980s, that what she wanted to do was move the restaurant to New York. Her brother was virulently opposed to this, and she wanted to do it, and eventually they did it, and Le Bernadotte is now in Midtown and extremely successful, has been for 20 years. Such was the, eventually her brother realized that she had made the right decision, and there came a time when they had to close the restaurant down in Paris, and he was supposed to fly back to cook the final meal. By this stage, he was so happy in New York. Apparently, there was a huge disagreement as to whether he'd actually get on the plane and go back to Paris and cook this meal. But in the end, he did, and the restaurant closed in Paris, and it's been an absolutely monumental success in New York. And it's very, very interesting how the market has changed. Le Bernadotte, for those who don't know, Le Bernadotte is perhaps the best seafood restaurant in New York. And when I was last in there early one evening, talking to Maggie, she could not, the restaurant was absolutely packed with young Asian customers, all of whom were taking, of course, pictures of the food. And Maggie could not believe the journey that has taken her from cooking shellfish in Brittany to New York, and how her following has changed. A lot of these wealthy Chinese, Asian customers obviously believe that fish is very good for you, and the more expensive it is, the better it is for you. So that's why they're there. She's a remarkable, remarkable story. This is another remarkable woman. This is Michele Garneau, an Australian, who, having cooked in Melbourne, moved to Hong Kong in the late 1980s. And then, as she was cooking, began to realize that China was opening up. And so, without speaking any Cantonese, moved to Shanghai and opened M on the Bund. And then, without speaking any Mandarin, she moved to Beijing and opened Capital M. And her story is absolutely extraordinary, because her culinary philosophy is that she will only cook dishes that she has actually eaten in the country of origin. which when you stop and think about it, would rule out a lot of chefs and a lot of dishes on a lot of menus. But she said that's what she wants to do. She doesn't have a single Chinese dish on her menu because she said I couldn't compete with the local Chinese restaurateurs. And she has made an astonishing success of two she was the first person to open up the Bund in Shanghai, and she's a remarkable, remarkable woman. This is Drew Nieporent, who was responsible for opening Nobu in New York and London, and is having great success at the moment with Batar. And he may look to you and to those who know him as the toughest guy in the world. In fact, I've never met a man with such thin skin. He hates a word of criticism, but has almost realized after 35 years that he has to combine this inner sensitivity with a very thick skin. I don't know how many of the audience have actually been on the end of a critical review. I have. Is there anybody else? Yes, I thought Dominic's would be. You've no idea how painful they are. But you just have to kind of swallow and get on with it, try and turn it into a way of boosting staff morale and get on with the job. But combining that inner sensitivity and a thick skin is something that every restaurateur has to do now. And finally, I think this is Hazel Allen, who runs Ballymaloe, the most wonderful cookery school and restaurant and hotel outside Cork in Ireland. And I think this is the one aspect of my book that I didn't deal with, but wish I had, because it is what everybody now has to face up to. And every restaurant has a huge environmental aspect, how we deal with climate change and so on and so on. And the final point, every restaurateur's ability to benefit its local community and charity is an extraordinary aspect of this business, which many of us turn to very good use. But I think if I were to write the book again, this is a subject that I would like to give much more prominence to. So that's my art of the restaurateur. I have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left, according to this very efficient clock. If there are any questions for me, I'll be around, obviously, but an accident. The FT in 1989 did not have a restaurant column. In fact, the year later, when I was introduced to the FT's former editor as the FT's restaurant correspondent, he said to me, I didn't realize the paper had stooped so low. So in those days, there wasn't a column. I met the editor, the weekend editor. I'd sold my restaurant, and I just sent him an article on spec. And he liked it, and he asked me one question. He said, do you want to be Nick or Nicholas? Because whatever you decide then, you're going to be professionally for the rest of your life. And that was it. I was very lucky. I once said to Lionel Barber, who's the FT's editor, that if we were both stupid enough to resign, I think there'd be more applicants for my job than for his. No? Yes?
How do you see the future of food and beverage?
In this region? Well, I think in 53 seconds, I think that's a very tricky question. But I'm very, very optimistic for food, beverage, hospitality worldwide. I think, the figures I just quoted from America, I think underlie it. I think the public's demand is huge. I think There are more and more young people who want to go in the business, which is great. And so I don't see any terrible issues other than the one of how can we best convert the pool of labour into talented staff. And I really think that's a huge industry-wide problem.
What's your sort of success story? How did you find success? So when you churn in these 10 people, the concept of what defines success?
You mean in terms of my book or generally?
Well, in general.
I think the great thing is what excites me as a restaurant critic, do their restaurant, you know. And for me, the acid test of any restaurant is if I've eaten a good meal in there, would I like to go back in 48 hours' time? We've got one more. Yeah?
In the UAE, do you see the fast food business as a massive threat to restaurants with a unique concept?
No, I think they sit side by side. I do think that this expression, cash rich and time poor, is something that we have to live with. And I think it's something that faces every restaurateur around the world. And I think it comes back to how they edit the menu and the wine list and how well trained the staff are. Can I bring up Jean-Luc Naret now and then take some questions at the end? Is that okay? I'm looking at the bosses at the back of the room. Huh? Right. Okay. Jean-Luc?